All right, right on. So my name is Colline, and I work at Google, but also a member of the SAFE working group. And today's discussion is going to be a little bit more informal. That actually we have kind of a small crew here, so that we can think through some of the various things we're discussing in the working group. And we're forming right now, so we're not exactly sure where we're going to end up. And we're taking on a pretty big problem, which is access control. And so the question is, what does that mean? What does access control mean? And there's various opinions. So for some of us, myself included, it's, can I do an action? So I'm a user and I try to do something. Can I actually do it? And there's a lot of things that go into that, right? There's an access control policy that says I'm explicitly allowed to do the action I'm doing. But then maybe if I'm starting a job, it's, do I have quota to do that thing? Or is someone going to pay for it? Or am I coming from the right network address? Or coming from the right laptop? Or any number of other potential variables that affect whether I can do something or not. So is that the definition of access, right? Or is access more narrowly defined to things like network policy or simply an authorization policy? So that's one thing that would be interesting to discuss. Secondly, we're thinking about personas, right, which is kind of related. Who are the folks that care about this stuff? Who are they, and who do we really have to think about in terms of when we're evaluating an access control system? Are we providing the right data to them? Are we giving them the right set of information, setting the right expectations? And so personas, traditionally, we talk about like a security admin. But there's also end users and developers. And then, if we go with the earlier question, there's a quota admin or a billing admin. And then there's also lower level admins, like there's a team captain, so to speak, right? Did it go to sleep? Team captains, and there are developers. And so how do we think about all these people, and do we have the right set of personas? And so we introduced that at the working group intro 2 days ago, and so maybe we can talk a little bit more about personas that we haven't thought about, or maybe we can discuss that we shouldn't consider those people, right? And then the next thing we want to think about are things like use cases, right? What are the prototypical use cases? What are we trying to solve? So, we can think of one, which is an end user trying to do something, right? Do we give them a clear error, right? Do we tell them, yes, you don't have access? And if they're in the same organization, do we tell them who they can go talk to? So many access control systems just give you an error saying you don't have access and you're stuck. And then it's an organizational concern to go like knock on the right door and talk to the right people and find out. And I've heard war stories just from Google where somebody in some organization's trying to use GCP for the first time, but they can't. They get a this has been disabled by your administrator, but then they don't even know who that is, and nobody in their organization knows who it is, and they spent a few weeks tracing around to find this person who's actually in an office in Bangalore, right? And they're in the US. So these are the types of things where, as designing an access control system, building in some level of messaging might be an interesting case for this. So to do that. Lastly here, there's a lot of prior art. Or not lastly, but there's a lot of prior art in what we're doing. So one of the particular ones that Christian found, or is at least turned me on to, is the NIST. And NIST actually has this document that describes evaluating emission control, or not emission, access control systems. And it's huge. It's like 50 pages. And it talks about a lot of good stuff. And so we can learn here, and we can actually figure out and try to distill that into something that's good for cloud native. And then lastly here, what are the attributes of an access control system? So, there's expressibility, right? Can I actually target this policy to the things that I want to, right? Or am I artificially limited by the system? Things like, hierarchy can kind of get in the way sometimes, where it's like, wow, I'm forced to put things in this or that, and I overgrant because it's not expressive enough. And then there's its opposite, which is explainability. Okay, so I can totally target everything, but how do I know what I'm targeting? And how do I understand what I'm doing? And so there are a lot of natural tensions in these systems. And so can we actually create a set of attributes that we can rate systems on. And my goal, what would be great, is literally that we have a number. We can say, well, this system has an expressibility of 10, but it has an explainability of a 1, right? And that, it's language we can start to put into the industry. And if each one of the cloud native projects, when they're putting out their policy systems, can have a rating, now as customers, they can figure out what they're getting into. So. Yeah.
And I think one other dimension here is that the policy working group mentioned that as well. We tend to design all of these things in isolation, right? There's a bunch of people that care about how we do quota, and they design a quota system that is for their use case. They may not even have the administrator take that into account, right? They have a very narrow focus. And then what we get is that all these policy systems have these slight incompatibilities and some horizontal. So and we want to make sure that at least as a first level, we understand what that is, right? So that we can then make suggestions on how to improve on that. So our goal is not to write something, to write code, right? Our code is to help us understand what these different problems are, and that we can then educate all of these other policy services on how to get better, right? So, but one of the things we were interested in is, who is an administrator here? Are we all just developers? Do people recognize some of those personas? The system administrator of a large organization that doesn't know what it means to make a certain change in the policy. They are afraid to make these changes because they just don't know what will happen. Right, and so one of the things that we like to do in the Administrator Bill of Rights is that we basically say we want to make sure that you can delegate these policy decisions to the people that have more knowledge, but that has to be done in a secure manner, right? You cannot simply allow anybody to make any policies, because then the whole wheels come off pretty soon. So how do we balance this tension of having control at the top, but then also allow you to delegate to the people that know more about the problem at hand than you do as the administrator? Can you, while I unlock?
Yeah, and in this vein, and again, please feel free to speak up at any time, because this is an open discussion. But I just went to the OPA talk, which was very good. And one of the thoughts I had is that, okay, so you could express policy as a code snippet, which is super powerful, right? And I can do that. And so one of the ones that I thought of for Kubernetes is, let's say I want to restrict which container registries you actually can pull from for pods, right? And so I express that as an OPA policy as code that says, and it compares, what's going on with in the pod, what the container registry against a list of that. Okay, cool. So there's an operation to be able to import data into OPA where you could put in the list of valid container registries, right? But at the end of the day, the admin who's up there really wants to think about it as a policy that says allowed container registries, and they want to be able to define a document that says this, and then that needs to get somehow converted into something that gets written into OPA. And it's that, for me at least, from an admin point of view and explainability point of view, being able to generalize that to say this is the format that we choose, and that those things are maybe implemented as OPA underneath the curtains, but then we can actually do something to make it more universal, right? More something with documentation and explain, and then these become first-class citizens. They become things we can talk about, right? And so, in this discussion, it's like surfacing those. So when companies write, or when we put out policies that are very general purpose, how do we have a framework so that they hit the admin Bill of Rights, so that they are explainable, that they are something that can be composed? I think this is something that Christian was thinking about. And yeah.
Describe explainability a little bit more from your point of view. Like, I've heard different definitions of it, I think.
Yeah.
And so I think
yeah, I love explainability. It's one of my favorite subjects, so I'm happy to yes, to explain what I mean by explainability. So in a lot of systems, you'll grant, let's say you grant a role, right? And so in GCP in particular, there's this idea that you make someone a virtual machine admin, right? A VM admin. Okay, cool. So what's not clear in GCP is what that really means, right? So I grant that to myself, and I grant it at this folder level. So I need to understand, one, everything that's in that folder. So all of its children will get that same role, right? So I want to say, okay, if I give you that, what does that really mean? Well, it means everything in this folder, you'll have that on. But the second thing is what permissions does that really grant, right? Someone could have tucked in like storage bucket reader into VM admin, right? And now, not even thinking about it, I just gave that person access to read buckets. Well, why did that happen? Well, it's because GCP has this composition model of this idea of a role, which is a list of permissions, right? But we don't put in our UI those list of permissions when you're granting. You just say, oh, that's VM admin. And then you think naturally, you're like, oh, that should be people who mess with VMs, not people who mess with buckets. But there's some side effect, and there's something that someone did somewhere, and we leave that away. Another thing of explainability is, hey, what does Torin have access to, right? I'm really concerned. I just want to go audit people. I want to see what's going on. His job title is this. What does he have access to? And then being able to get a list and say, this is all the things that he can do, right? For compliance reasons, that's very important. Like for PCI compliance, that is stated right there. You're able to explain who has access and why they have access, right? And when the auditors come in, they ask you how they do that, and you'll see some of the answers that people put down. They're very tenuous, right? So being able to give that. The other thing is when you have attribute-based access control systems, where you basically say like, okay, with this set of attributes, you're coming from this laptop, you're coming from this IP, you're coming from this, environment, and then you put those onto various things. So you say, if you have this group of attributes, then you're allowed to access these sets of things, right? The problem is how do you know when you grant an attribute to someone, what that really gives you access to? Right? Because the only way you can do that is you have to sum up, you have to go look at every resource, you have to look at all the attributes that especially if they're ORed together, right? And then say, these are the list of resources that give access to. And so, we're suffering in a problem of basically I think most access controls are over-granted, right? And the reason for that is because people don't fully understand what they're doing when they do it, and they go, well, I'll just give that to you, and they don't understand the impact. So does that help give three?
We
Yeah.
analyzed, the kind of top 500 projects by usage on GCP. Okay, so we did an analysis of the top 500 most used projects on GCP, compare their access policies against other logs from last 30 days. These are policies that enterprise customers set for themselves, and we found there's about 95% over-granting. So 95% of the permissions that are granted to certain identities that are never exercised in the last 30 days.
I think it's probably worse in small companies.
Yeah.
Small company,
And-
this needs this, and then you don't know exactly what
Yeah.
it needs.
And that's really scary because those top 500 projects, I bet, are from the large enterprise companies with full-time security admins that need to pass compliance. We're not even getting to the little companies yet.
And you also have a natural progression, right? The small companies of today, you start your project, you give yourself, I can do everything in this project. Then you hire more people, and then you need to have a good way of controlling, while you grow, who should have access, right? The CEO doesn't need to have access to everything anymore just because he had that in the beginning. Yeah.
I think from some of the customers we've spoken. Can everyone hear me? I think from some of the customers we've spoken to, it really does come down to the culture of the company to a certain extent, and big versus small is part of that. But also, do developers or end users have control over the culture, or does the security team have control over the culture? And is this an opt-in or an opt-out model to security? And so there's.
Yeah. So, some smaller companies, and it's not there yet. But what we've noticed is that you start small, right? And then as soon as you get your first round of funding, okay, you're a little bit bigger. And then when you get your Series B, right, and you're starting to think about S1 filings, then it becomes a big deal, right? And so, if you've entrenched yourself into a bunch of systems that are hard to explain and hard to understand access, and you've been over granting, then there becomes this fire drill that you do before your S1 to go back and clean up and take care of the stuff, right? So can we help people get there from the start? Mm-hmm. And again, I think safe by default is kind of the admin's goal, right? Mm-hmm. And the better we can explain things, the better people will feel safe by default, which then enables developers to be more self-serve, right?
I think by cultural though, so I
Yeah.
completely agree with all of that. But I think, as you get into companies that have teams around security and teams around compliance, in many cases their position is default no. When you have operators who just want to say get a workload into production, their position is default yes. And you have this quite, I think, healthy tension between people who want to see policies complied with
Yeah.
and teams that just want stuff to work. And one of the attributes of a good access control system should be that it is able to provide a language and provide a mechanism that allows these two folks to coexist without being at each other's throat all the time.
Yes, I have a slightly different take, right? And maybe it's because, why are compliance people fearful, right? In a way, that's the default no. And I think it's because they don't have full understanding of the system. And so, if they could be reasonably assured that their intentions are being met, right? That the system is meeting their intentions, I bet you'd see a convergence between developers and compliance people, right? And I think that tension exists today is because we don't have good tools for determining who has access to what. And so therefore, the only thing that they can do is to react saying, no one gets access to everything and I approve everything, right, to make sure. Is that?
Yeah, I completely agree
Yeah.
with that. I'd extend it as well and say there's a reciprocal piece from the developer standpoint, which is if you can tell me up front before I've engaged in a long development cycle that there's actually very good reasons why you can't talk to this other thing or you don't have this particular right on this resource, then you can either negotiate that or you can work around it rather than hit a wall at production time.
Yeah. That's absolutely.
I think one thing that is also important, we want to give people the ability. At Google, we have this default setting of trust but verify, right? So we implicitly trust our developers to do the right thing, but we check that they actually do that. And if they don't, we fire them. And you want to be able to, we don't allow certain things. And so we want to be able to allow people to do a setting like that, right? We talk to some of these cloud native companies and we can see that they have a similar notion, right? And in order to do that, you need strong audit capabilities, right? And that these strong audit capabilities fundamentally then allow to give the developers more trust, right? We allow them to do the right thing and we can see when they do the wrong thing, and then we can react to that.
That's right. And again, just from the OPA talk earlier, one of the things I really liked about it is you can actually return audit, right? You can say access, allowed equals audit, and then tells the underlying system what to do, and that gets coded into the policy rather than coded into the code. And so things like that I think are helpful. And then also defining a standard for everything should be auditable, right? Or it should be, a standard way of specifying that. And I think, what I see is that in a lot of systems they don't allow for dry run modes or things like that help you understand what you're going to do and whether this is okay or not gets to the point you were making earlier. So
Auditing is not enough. You need more practices, more tooling around getting all those audit logs in and see to compare, because you said you compare what the GCP users are doing. Those tools we don't have in hand. It could be very interesting to have in a company. Those are all the audit logs. Okay, those are the things granted to users. What's too much?
Yes. So at Google we have built very sophisticated. So the comment was, sorry, I didn't give you a microphone in time. That we not only need auditing, but we also need a way to analyze those audit logs to see that something bad happened. So at Google, we have built those internal tools, right? And I think it would be really interesting to make some of those available to customers as well, right? What is the interesting data that you want to analyze, right? So what we typically do is there's some analysis of what is privileged and what is not, and then we join that with what you access.
So this is cool because we haven't really talked a lot about audit logging in auditing a lot in our meetings so far. So I really appreciate that this is coming up here, and it's something that I think we should add as a clear use case, right? That we should be covering for certain. And then it feels like with a lot with things like Kubeflow and whatnot, like building pipelines for people to do this on a regular basis and encouraging standardization among at least the cloud native projects, I would hope, right, would be a really beneficial thing. So if you use these products, you have some level of guarantee that they support this auditing system and they can tell you who's used what when, whether you're over granting, whether you have a surprise. So that's cool. I like that a lot.
Yeah, and then one of the interesting things that is happening is this evaluation of existing access control systems. So we talk to some of the large customers out there that have interesting use cases, and we ask them, what is the interesting problem that you are facing, right? And I bet in a lot of enterprises, people have this problem that we see at the moment in Google. There is an Active Directory somewhere, and the administrators think about access policy as, whatever I have in my Active Directory. And how do you map that into the policy systems in Kubernetes? Right? How do you map your Active Directory into an RBAC policy that is reflecting the policy that is supposed to be in that Active Directory? And how do you do that when the data gets federated? Right? I think that is an interesting thing that we learned from the NIST folks. They said that one of the problems they are facing is how do you do big data analysis over data that has access control? Typically what happens is we ingress that whole data and then we throw all the policies away and we assume, whoever has that data is allowed to analyze it. Otherwise we wouldn't have given it to them, right? But it would be interesting probably to be able to say, okay, here's my complete medical record, and if you only want to do something on, addresses of people that go to a clinic, that is probably something that some analysts can do, but they are not allowed to see, what I was there for. Right, and if you immediately throw away your access control policy when you ingress into a big data system, then you cannot do these kinds of things.
Yeah. Yes.
Cool. Press the button. Okay. Cool. One thing that I've sort of seen, just as a consultant for the last couple of years. The company I worked at, we were really big proponents of this idea of sort of agile security, and meaning you're building in security concerns and tooling in your continuous delivery pipelines. And security people seem to like that. And they seem to, if we can provide certain guarantees in our delivery pipeline, can we move faster? And, some of the, I don't want to say smarter, but some of the more hip teams are, they see the tooling, they see the logs, we're doing it every single time. We can prove that before anything can go to production, it's going through these checks. Cool. Move as fast as you want, basically. Access is a little bit different. And there's always that one security person who doesn't really trust the tooling as much because there are code pathways potentially that won't be executed until that one time, and those tools aren't checking all of your code paths, right? And so access control is sort of in a similar vein where unless you're checking all of the code paths of your entire code base, you don't know what's attempting to make access to what, because those things may not be executed in your test environment. And so the idea of auditing is great, but there may be incidents that don't show up until it's been in production for 4 or 5 years, right? And so what I've kind of been pondering about this for a long time. It's it would be great. I went to the OPA, discussions as well, and they were really cool. If there's a common language that describes not only access control policies but policy in general, the idea of having formal proofs actually isn't that, it's not out of the ordinary. It's not out of the realm of possibility. We can prove that before you ship this thing, that these two things communicating to each other, all of the paths are good. We could have some sort of guarantee that those concerns that you have will never occur.
Yeah, Amazon are doing some. AWS are doing formal methods on their access control policies, and that stuff is working and tractable, and that's what they use for sending people alerts on their S3 buckets that their access permissions are not what they think probably not what they meant. And so those things are definitely possible if you've got the right kind of framework and you've thought about it and do the work. It's definitely tractable.
And I think that also goes into the direction of explainability, right? Can you correlate your machine readable policy to a human understandable policy in some form, right?
Oh, I was just going to suggest a middle ground in some ways. If you can't do formal proofs, that you can at least analyze access patterns, see what policies remain open but unused, and close those down proactively, so that you you can identify some holes.
So, if you in environments like for Istio, for example, you can actually set as a matter of policy who you can talk to and who can talk to you, right? And if you can specify that as policy, you have a more reasonable guarantee that you understand the nature of your code, because you've effectively boiled it down to a graph that you can show on a wall and say, these are the only things that are allowed to talk to each other. So sometimes, depending on the tooling, like these things all work together to kind of create this again, secure by default environment. I like the idea of taking a set of language and really figuring that out to see if we could do formal proofs. I'd like to understand more about the Amazon, how they do that and what value it brings.
And
personally.
so one thing that we do at Google, we have some policy that when that gets introduced, we can run that in log-only mode for a while. So you can actually observe what would happen, and then you can lock it down later based on that observation. That obviously makes it necessary that you need to run actual workloads against that policy, right? So the thing that is our perennial fear is this once a year or once a quarter analysis that some financial person is running, right? You just don't see that until it's too late, right? You run everything else, and then at the end of the quarter, some additional access pattern happens that you've never observed before, right?
Yeah, that's interesting. Cool. So we talked about explainability a bunch, right? And what I found is it generally has a tension between expressibility, right? And then one of the things that comes up a lot in policy stuff is, well, how do you deal with composition of policy, right? And so it was one of the questions I wanted to ask in the OPA talk, where it's like in their system, if you have multiple layers that express the same policy, right? You do a composition model. Those composition models now are completely ad hoc, right? In terms of some people do inheritance. If you're, like I am. Some people use like networking policies use rule numbers, right? Other systems have full override capability. So, the policy system within G Suite, for example, you can do fully expressive overrides, and then you can do this like group layering on top of it. And so it becomes, difficult for operators, and we talk about the personas, right? We're giving them all different ways of doing this. And you look at quota is the minimum of every level above you, right? If you're doing hierarchical quota. And something Christian and I were discussing is can we formalize what that means, right? Can we say, here is the way that and it's fully expressive, but you have a way to state that in one way, so you can evaluate a policy and say, okay, I understand how this does inheritance, but I'm not sure you can actually have one size fits all composition, right? Each scenario has just a different thing. Plus, there's conventions. Network admins have been doing it for 40 years. They've been dealing with rule numbers in iOS, right, in Cisco iOS and things of that sort. And coming in and saying, hey, there's this brand new thing, is just going to be received hostile by the network admin persona in many companies. So, I think just as a general thought experiment is how can we accommodate for kind of the past and what's there, and also be able to formalize it and say, this is the model, and therefore I can express it in something like that, and I can understand that this is how it works and whatnot, and then be able to give an attribute to it to say like how composable is things or whatnot and whatnot. So that's just my thought experiment. Yeah.
A lot of that's about usability. I think if you give people tools that if you give people tools that do answer their questions about explainability and they understand how to pose their problems, they will potentially, over time, if it's compelling, change how they do these things. Because if you offer them a framework that's got tests, whereas their iOS rules do not have tests, that's compelling value that people will understand.
Test, yeah. Yeah, so I guess one of the goals with OPA from the beginning has been to create a language that you can scale or grow, basically, right? So you can write those low-level rules that are referring to like deeply nested values, but you can also write higher-level rules that are much more human readable. Now, the other side of that is like giving people full expressiveness to do like looping and all those kinds of things. But we've always wanted to have like fragments of the language that are for specific purposes, right? And so you might have a fragment of the language that fits very well for like network security. And there's a bunch of benefits to doing that because then you can take that policies written in that fragment and you can compile them down to BPF or IP tables or whatever. So I think you could easily imagine having fragments that are, that restrict the type of composition that you can do. So I think that's an excellent like design goal for something, for the language.
Yeah, and then one of the other problems that we see now is the federation aspect, right? Almost everybody is dealing with multiple of these access control systems, be it at your own company, be it at the various cloud providers, in the various open source systems you are using, right? If you run a MySQL inside a Kubernetes, even though it's all open source, you still have to deal with two different incompatible access control systems, and making sure that the policy that you have is accurately reflected in the policies for these individual systems is a challenge.
Yeah. Press again. Okay. Do I have to hold it down? Yes, I do. Okay. I think I like the way this discussion is going a lot, but I think that there's something that, like, there are steps that we can do now to improve the problem. Just documenting what you have.
Yeah.
Like,
and that is the goal. We don't want to write these systems,
right,
we want to document what is out there, so at least we have better understanding.
Right, but I think like that in itself is an exercise that people don't really have guidance on how to do. Like how do you document IP table policy without dumping the entire thing into an Excel spreadsheet, right? And there's no good way to translate even the current set of systems into something that can be aggregated and understood by everyone. And so, yeah, we're introducing new systems that are able to help sort of alleviate some of that stress in new systems, but what about the stuff that we already have? Can we provide some guidance to enable an understanding of that?
I want to add on top of that, because it's a good idea. I want to add on top of that the documentation is great, but then the next part is how to analyze the patterns, how to analyze all the things that are on the audit logs. So I think it's twofold, documentation and how to analyze.
I mean, one truth I think that at least I believe is that every system that comes out is going to have some sort of policy management system built in, and each of these systems needs to, by necessity, generally is in isolation, right? So you can run MySQL on bare metal, you can run it on Kubernetes, you can run it, on any number of scenarios, and it can be run standalone. So it needs its own policy management system to be able to control who has access to what tables and what data. Meanwhile, it might be combined with an application, right? And so these things are composable unfortunately, by their very nature, and it makes it difficult to do like a one-size-fits-all. So we're kind of in the game of making these things talk together, right? And I hope, right, in this thing is that we can come together and say at least have these attributes so it's explainable and documentable in terms of how things work, so people can start to understand what the capabilities of the system are, what the how the policies are expressed, and then be able to compare in their environments to at least say, okay, I have MySQL, I have this, but they all have the same concepts, and so therefore I can express my intent, and I express my intent in MySQL by doing this, and I express my intent in Kubernetes by doing that, right? I think if we can get there, that's a journey on the road to, I think, a more universal system. So I appreciate that comment for certain.
And so one of the things we should tell people is how you can find us. We didn't put a URL here. So it's the Safe Working Group is part of or we want to become a member of the Cloud Native Foundation. We are on GitHub, so we try to make all of our discussions transparent. We post our weekly meeting notes there. We are starting to use issues on GitHub to start discussions. So if you're interested, open an issue on there and start to talk to us.
Thank you.